The Duke set down his pen, without looking up, and said that she might have the ruined orangery, since a woman wanted occupation for her hands, and then he left the room before she could answer him. Lynette Hallow, Duchess of Larkspur these 6 weeks, and still unused to the weight of the name, stood a moment longer at the study door, with her hands folded at her waist, and said nothing at all, which was, of every answer available to her, the one she had practised longest. She did not yet know that the glass house holding nothing but broken panes and a decade of frost would, before the year turned, hold the proof that cleared a dead man's name and fed half the county besides. Had she known it that morning, she would have thanked him for the gift, instead of merely inclining her head. The orangery stood at the east end of the gardens, its iron ribs rusted red, its glass shattered into a carpet that crunched underfoot like old ice, and everyone from the housekeeper to the stable boys called it, without unkindness, the Duke's folly, though none of them could say any longer whether they meant the building or the marriage that had produced its new keeper. Michaelmas had come and gone a fortnight since. The trustees of the old Duchess's will had set their date plainly upon a single sheet of vellum that Julian Vantry, Duke of Larkspur, kept locked in the second drawer of his desk by Martinmas, when the county gathered for the harvest court to pay its rents and hear its accounts read aloud in the tenants' hall. The Duke must show the estate solvent and soundly kept, a full year married and a full year proven, or the whole of his grandmother's unentailed fortune, the only money left that was not already mortgaged to the roof-beams, would pass instead to his cousin Edmund, who managed the ledgers now, and smiled at everyone with the particular gentleness of a man who has never once needed to raise his voice to get what he wants. Lynette walked the length of the orangery that same afternoon with her father's pruning knife at her belt, its bone handle worn smooth where his thumb had rested for 30 years, before her own thumb inherited the habit, and she read the ruin the way her father had taught her to read any garden, not by what stood, but by what had once stood, and left its mark in dying. Here, along the south wall, the ghost shapes of citrus trees showed in the brickwork, pale rectangles where trained branches had once been nailed, and had, in leaving, taken the soot of 40 winters with them. Here the flue that should have warmed the beds in frost lay, collapsed and cold. She crouched and took a pinch of the black earth between finger and thumb, rubbed it, smelled it, the old test her father had shown her before she could properly write her letters. Soil never lies, he used to say. It only waits to be asked the right question. She had been 26 years learning to ask questions of soil and account books both, the two languages he had taught her side by side at the same kitchen table. Before the year everything had gone to ruin, and he had died of a shame that was never, she was certain down to the marrow, rightly his to carry. She had come to Larkspur under her own name, because she had nothing else left to come under, and if the name meant anything to anyone in this house, no one had yet said so to her face. She was not left long to her solitary reading. A voice behind her, rough as gravel under a cartwheel, said that she had her father's way of crouching, which was a strange thing to notice in a woman who called herself a stranger to the place. She turned. An old man stood in the ruined doorway with a rake over one shoulder, and hens picking at the frost killed weeds around his boots. And something in the set of his jaw told her before he spoke again that he had been waiting 5 years for someone to come back and ask him the question everyone else had stopped asking. His name, he told her, was Barnaby Sixsmith, and he had dug this ground under Thomas Hallow for 11 years before they turned the old man out for a thief, though Sixsmith had buried 3 wives and 2 sons in his time, and never once seen a liar's face on Thomas Hallow, and he would say so to the king himself if the king ever troubled to ask a gardener anything. Linnet's hand went still on the knife at her belt. She told him, quietly, that Thomas Hallow was her father, and watched the old man's face do something between weeping and laughing, and neither of them said anything further about it for a long moment, because some truths, once spoken, want only silence to settle in. She had married the Duke of Larkspur 8 weeks after a vicar in her own poor parish, moved by pity or by shrewdness, had written to say that the Duke required a sensible wife of no fortune and no family to trouble him, and that Miss Hallow, penniless, orphaned, and unremarkable to look at, might suit a bargain neither party need dress up as romance. She had gone to the interview expecting a vain man wanting an ornament, and had found instead a big, still, grave man of 31 who had looked at her hands, chapped and ink-stained and calloused from mending other women's linen for wages, and asked her, without preamble, whether she could keep an account-book honestly. She had said that she could keep one better than honestly. She could keep one so that a thief could not hide inside it. Something had moved behind his eyes then, gone as quickly as it came, and he had said that terms were terms, that she would have her own establishment and her own allowance, and no claim made upon her beyond the outward forms of the thing, and that he would ask nothing further of her than her name upon a register and her discretion afterward. She had agreed, because the alternative was a poorhouse or a cousin's grudging charity, and because a bargain honestly stated, she had thought, cost less than a courtship dishonestly conducted. It was only after the wedding, in the cold weeks that followed, that she began to understand there was a whole house behind his silences that he had not troubled to mention, and a date circled in a lawyer's hand that made her, whether either of them liked it or not, the instrument of his survival. She found him in the estate office 2 days after Sixsmith had named her father to her, and she did not wait to be granted the courtesy of a chair before she spoke. She said that the orangery would want more than a woman's idle hands. It would want glaziers, and coal for the flue, and rootstock, and a full season's wages for at least 2 men, and she meant to have all of it, in writing, before she broke another pane of frost off the beds. He looked up from his ledgers the way a man looks up from a debt he has been adding all night and finding no smaller. He said that the estate could spare very little just now. She said that the estate could spare exactly as much as he decided it could, and that she had not married him to be given a ruin, and denied the tools to mend it. There was a silence in which she watched him decide not to be angry, which was, she was beginning to learn, the only kind of anger he permitted himself in company. He said, at last, that she might have what the glass-house required, on the condition that she kept its accounts herself, separate from the rest, and showed them to no one but him. She asked him why such secrecy over broken glass. He said only that there was a debt in this house, whose size he had not told her, and a reason he could not yet lay before her for the haste of their marriage, and that he would ask her to trust him in this as he was trusting her with the orangery. She said that trust given without reason was only obedience wearing a kinder coat. He almost smiled at that. She saw the corner of his mouth consider it and think better of it, and said that she was welcome to think so long as she kept the ledger. Sixsmith became her second hire before she had made her first. He brought with him, unbidden, a boy named Tam, who could carry glass without breaking it, which was rarer than it sounds. And between the 3 of them they cleared the worst of the ruin before the first hard frost. It was Sixsmith who first said, leaning on his rake in the thin autumn light, that weeds did not die because a body cursed them in the dark. They died because you pulled them in daylight, root and all, where every soul in the parish could see they were gone. Lynette turned the words over more than once in the weeks that followed, not knowing yet how exactly she would need them. The soft threat came, as such things generally do in a great house, wrapped in courtesy. Edmund Vantry found her at the glass-house door in the honeyed hour before supper, immaculate in a grey coat that had never once, she suspected, touched honest dirt, smelling faintly and always of orange flower water, an affectation she found curious in a man who managed an estate that had not seen a living orange tree in 5 years. He admired her industry, he said, in a voice pitched low and warm as a hearth. He hoped she would not tire herself with old ruins better left buried. Some ground, he said, kept its secrets for good reason, and a wise woman knew when a thing was better left unturned than exhumed. He said it all smiling, his gloved hand smoothing the cuff of his coat, and he was gone again, before she had finished deciding whether she had been threatened or merely advised. She stood a long while after he left, the scent of orange blossom fading slowly out of the cold air, and thought that a man who feared nothing did not trouble himself to warn a woman off an empty room. The county, meanwhile, had opinions, as counties will. At the village shop the wagers ran 2-1 against the Duchess's glasshouse surviving to Christmastide, and old women who had never met her called her the poor bride who had married a ruin to mend a ruin, not unkindly, but as one repeats a joke grown comfortable with age. Callers came to Larkspur that autumn in greater number than the house had seen in years, ostensibly to pay respects to the new Duchess, actually to look at her hands and her gowns and decide for themselves whether the rumour of her low birth explained the strangeness of the marriage. Lynette received them with the particular calm of a woman who has spent a lifetime being looked past, and gave away nothing, and it was in receiving one such caller, a Miss Araminta Blythe, cool and handsome and betrothed, everyone said, to Mr. Edmund Vantry, that Lynette first noticed the younger woman watching her with an attention that was not quite unkindness, and not quite anything else Lynette could yet name. The first clue came in October, filed away almost without her noticing it, clearing the old potting shed attached to the glasshouse's north wall. Sixsmith's boy Tam pulled free a rotted invoice book, its pages fused with damp, from beneath a collapsed shelf. Most of it was ruined past reading. But one page, pressed flat against a tin box that had kept the damp from it, showed a nurseryman's hand, Pruitt's, the name still legible at the foot, recording the delivery of 11 Seville orange trees in a year Lynette recognised at once as the year of her father's disgrace, and beside the entry, in a different ink and a different, more careful hand, the word paid, twice underlined. She did not yet know what it meant. She only knew, folding it small and tucking it beneath the lining of her workbox, that it was the first true thing the ruin had given up to her, and that a garden, like a ledger, told no lies, it only waited to be asked. Winter's approach sharpened the work into a shared labour that left little room for the careful distance both of them had promised at the outset. Julian took to walking the gardens in the evenings, ostensibly to inspect the glazing, and Lynette noticed that his visits fell more often after the estate books had gone badly than after they had gone well, though he never said so. It was over the resetting of the old flue. In November, both of them on their knees in brick dust with their sleeves rolled past the elbow, that the first real thaw between them showed itself. He asked her, without looking up from the mortar he was troweling with more competence than any duke had strict need of, where a companion's daughter had learned to lay brick. She told him her father had taught her everything he knew twice over, once as a trade and once as a kind of love, and that she had learned young that a girl with no dowry had better learn to be useful than to be admired. Something in his hand stilled at that. He said, low, that his own father had taught him accounts the same way, as if competence were the only inheritance a man could be certain would not be taken from him again. It was the first time either of them had spoken of a dead parent without armour on the words, and neither pressed further. But Lynette marked it, the way she marked frost dates and rainfall, as a thing worth remembering. She told him, that same evening, one card of her secret and kept the rest close. She said that she had reason to believe her father's dismissal had not been honestly earned, and that she meant, in restoring this ruin, to learn why. She did not yet say the name Pruitt, nor the word paid twice underlined in a stranger's ink. Julian was quiet a long moment, turning his trowel over in his hand. He said only that he understood, better than she knew, what it was to inherit a story about a man's disgrace and never quite trust its seams, and that when he could tell her the whole of what troubled the estate's accounts he would, but that the telling was not entirely his to give yet. She wanted to press him. She did not. A bargain, honestly stated, she reminded herself, cost less than a courtship dishonestly conducted, and she let the unfinished sentence stand between them like a debt both of them intended to pay. It was in December, with frost thick on every pane they had not yet reglazed, that she heard him laugh for the first time. A short, startled sound at something Tam said about a hen that had taken up residence in an empty citrus pot, as though she meant to hatch an orange, and Lynette found she had stopped what she was doing entirely to listen to it, the way one stops to listen to a bird one has not heard sing before. He seemed almost as surprised by the sound as she was. He did not laugh again for some days after, as if he had spent it carefully and wished to be sure it would not run out before it was wanted. The blow, when it came, arrived dressed as concern. Edmund brought the ledgers to Julian's study one grey morning in December, with Sir Josiah Prynne, the trustee, seated grave and silent in the corner chair, and laid before them a column of figures that made Lynette's own careful hand look, on the page like extravagance run wild, coal, glass, wages, root stock, all of it correctly entered by her own pen, and yet totalled, by some art of arrangement Edmund had performed upon the sums around it, to a figure that dwarfed what the rest of the estate could show in income for the quarter. Edmund's voice was gentle throughout, regretful even, a man laying bad news before a friend rather than a weapon before a target. He wondered aloud, mildly, whether a woman raised so near poverty might not have found herself dazzled by sudden means and spent beyond her judgment. He wondered, more mildly still, whether the Duchess's zeal for the old ruins sprang from simple industry, or from some notion, however innocently held, that her father's dismissal had hidden money about the place worth the digging for. He said he meant no accusation. He said it twice. Sir Josiah's face, listening, gave nothing away, which frightened Lynette a great deal more than open hostility would have done. She did not weep, and did not raise her voice, and said only that her ledger would answer for every shilling entered in it, penny matched to receipt, whenever anyone cared to ask it honestly instead of arranging it cleverly. But she felt the ground shift under her all the same, felt the whole county's wagering laughter curdle, somewhere behind her, into something with teeth, and understood for the first time the particular cruelty of a lie built entirely from true numbers wrongly stacked. The fallout came swiftly and unkindly, as such things do once the first stone has been thrown. Callers who had come all autumn to admire her industry now came, or more often did not come, to whisper instead about the thief's daughter married for pity and grown greedy with her second chance. Julian, cornered daily by Sir Josiah's careful, patient questions, grew greyer and quieter, and Linnet, watching him fail to defend her with the ease she had hoped for, felt the first true coldness of the marriage settle into her chest, not because he doubted her, she did not think even then that he doubted her, but because he seemed unable to say plainly that he did not. It was Edmund who came to her alone, 3 days before Christmas, in the glass house itself, uninvited, smelling of orange flowers in a room that had none. He was sorry, he said, for the talk the county was making of her. He had a solution, if she would hear it. A sum, generous, settled quietly upon her through his own hand, and a quiet departure before Martinmas, framed as a visit to unnamed relations, that would spare the Duke the scandal of an unequal marriage grown troublesome, and spare her the county's teeth. He said it kindly. He said it as a man does a favour for someone he pities. Lynette set down the trowel she had been holding, and wiped her hands slowly on her apron, and told him that she had buried a father who died, believing himself dishonoured, rather than take money that was not owed to him, and that she had no intention of proving herself less than he had been. She told Edmund, evenly, that she would not go. She watched something small and cold move behind his immaculate composure, gone as fast as it came, and understood, without yet having proof enough to say why, that she had just refused the one thing that could have made this all quietly disappear, and that the refusal would cost her more before it cost him anything at all. It cost her within the week. Julian, worn thin by Sir Josiah's questions, and by a letter from Edmund suggesting, with great regret, that the Duchess's presence in the orangery accounts be suspended pending the trustees' full review, told her, gently, but told her, that she must set the ledger aside until Martinmas, and let Edmund's clerks examine the books unhindered. She heard, beneath the gentleness, a man choosing the safety of doubt over the risk of certainty, and it struck her harder than open accusation would have done. She did not shout. She said only that a man who would not stand beside her needed to decide, before Martinmas came, whether he had married a wife or hired a caretaker. And she left him standing in his own study with that question unanswered between them, which felt, walking away from it, very much like walking away from the marriage itself. She was in the frozen garden 2 mornings later, locked out of her own ledger and her own glass-house, by an order she had not been consulted on, when Sixsmith came at a run she had not thought his old legs still had in them, Tam close behind with a lantern though it was full daylight, and told her that in pulling up the last of the collapsed flue tiles to lay proper new brick, they had found, wedged into the cold store beneath the old stove, a canvas-wrapped book, oiled against the damp, with her father's hand on every page. She held it a long moment before she opened it, the bone-handled knife cold at her belt, and asked herself, before she asked the book, whether what she was about to read would clear her father's name, or bury it deeper than any lie ever could. She did not sleep that night, nor did Sixsmith, nor, once she had sent word to him by Tam with the single line found something, did Julian, who came to the glass-house before dawn, with his coat thrown over his nightclothes, and no pretence left in his face at all. The day-book, in her father's careful hand, ran 7 years, and every page told the same quiet story in different figures. Crates of citrus and vine stock ordered from Pruitt's nursery, paid for from the estate's coffers at prices her father had recorded faithfully as they were billed, and beside nearly every entry, in her father's smaller marginal hand, a note of what had actually arrived at the gate, sometimes half the trees invoiced, sometimes none at all, always the difference pocketed by whoever had arranged the order, which her father, in the last entries before his dismissal, had begun at last to name. Not Thomas Hallow. Edmund Vantry, written plainly, 3 times, in the final months, alongside a note that the gardener meant to lay the discrepancy before the old Duke himself, before quarter day. He never had the chance. Within a fortnight of that final entry, Thomas Hallow had been accused instead, dismissed in disgrace before he could speak, his own honest accounting turned against him by a faster hand and a gentler voice than his own. Julian read the last page twice, his jaw working, his hand flat and still against the potting bench the way she had learned. By now, meant a man holding himself against a blow he would not let his face report. He said, at last, very low, that his own father had died believing a gardener's theft had ruined this house, and that he had spent 5 years learning to trust no one because of a lie he now held proof of in his own 2 hands. He said he was sorry, plainly, without excuse offered for the sorry's lateness. Linnet, watching him, found she believed him entirely, and found also that belief alone would not be enough. A daybook in a locked drawer proved nothing to a county that had already decided what it thought of her. What it wanted, Sixsmith said, leaning in the doorway with his rake forgotten against the frame, was daylight and witnesses, and the weeds pulled where every soul in the parish could watch them go. They had 11 days until Martinmas, and they spent them building a case the way Linnet built a bed of winter greens, methodically in the right order, nothing planted before its season. Pruitt's name recurred through every page of the daybook, and it was Sixsmith, who had known the nurseryman 30 years, who rode out to find him, and returned with the man himself 2 days later, grey-faced and reluctant, half persuaded and half terrified, a bundle of his own old order books under his arm that he had, he confessed, kept all this while against the day someone finally asked him the honest question instead of the convenient one. Araminta Blythe came to Linnet unbidden on the 9th day, cool as ever in her manner but not, Linnet saw now, cold in her heart, and said she had overheard enough through a half-open door in her own father's house. Edmund's voice, low and urgent, instructing someone that the old daybook must be found before the Duchess found it first, to know which side of this she meant to stand on when it mattered, whatever it cost her betrothal. Sir Josiah Prynne, approached carefully by Julian with the daybook laid plainly before him, said only that he had wondered, for longer than anyone knew, why the estate's fortunes had never matched its harvests, and that he would hear the whole of it properly, in the light, before the assembled tenantry, as the old Duchess's will required. Edmund's composure cracked only once in those 11 days, and Linnet was there to see it. She met him by chance at the glass-house door, the frost thick on the panes now fully reglazed, the beds beneath them green with forced lettuce, and the first pale shoots of a citrus grafted onto hardier stock. And he stood a long moment looking at what she had made of his ruin before he spoke. He said, softly, that some things were better left buried. She told him, just as softly, that she had learned that from him already, and that she did not intend to take the lesson twice. For the first time since she had known him, his hand, smoothing his cuff, was not quite steady, and the scent of orange flowers that clung to him seemed, in that cold doorway, less an affectation than a man perfuming himself against a smell of failure he could feel rising. The harvest court convened on Martinmas morning in the long tenants' hall, trestle tables scrubbed pale. Every family in the county crowded shoulder to shoulder on the benches to hear the year's accounts read, as they had been read every Martinmas of living memory, though none of them had ever expected to hear what this one held. Sir Josiah Prynne sat at the high table with the will's seal before him, Julian at his right hand, Lynette at Julian's, and Edmund, immaculate as ever in grey, seated at the trustee's left, with the estate's official ledgers stacked neat before him, smiling at the room the way a man smiles who believes the numbers already favour him. He opened the reading himself, smooth and unhurried, walking the hall through a year of accounts that painted, once again, a duchess's extravagance against a steward's careful thrift, and the room, which had wagered against her glass-house all autumn, began to nod along in the particular satisfied way of people watching a suspicion confirmed. Lynette rose when he had finished, and laid upon the table before Sir Josiah 2 things: her father's day-book, oiled canvas still faintly dark, with the damp of its long hiding, and beside it the rotted invoice page Tam had pulled from beneath the potting-shed shelf 5 months before, the word paid twice underlined in an ink she now asked, plainly, before the whole hall, whether anyone present recognised. Sir Josiah held the invoice to the window-light, turning it, and asked Mr. Pruitt, seated pale among the tenants, to come forward and say whose hand had written that underlined word. Pruitt did not answer at once. Sir Josiah asked him a second, more precise question, quiet enough that the whole hall leaned in to hear it. "How many crates of citrus did you carry through that gate yourself, Mr. Pruitt, in the year the day-book names? Not how many you were paid for, but how many your own hands set down on this estate's ground?" Pruitt's composure went first in his hands, then in his voice. "4," he said. "4 crates of 11 billed, and the difference paid to him in silence money by Mr. Vantry every quarter since, to keep his order books quiet and his mouth quieter, and he had kept both, God forgive him, because a man with 6 children learns to fear a great house's displeasure more than his own conscience, until a duchess had asked him a question honestly enough that he found he no longer could. The hall had gone very still. Sixsmith from the back benches said nothing at all, which somehow carried further than shouting would have. Araminta Blythe stood next, unbidden, and told the room plainly what she had overheard through her father's half-open door, and what it had cost her to say it aloud before the man she had been promised to. Her voice did not shake, though her hands, Lynette noticed, were laced tight enough to whiten the knuckles. And then Sir Josiah drew out, from among Pruitt's own surrendered papers, 3 letters in Edmund's unmistakable hand, instructing the nurseryman, in words too plain for any gentler reading to survive: "Falsify the delivery, hold your tongue. The difference is mine to keep and yours to earn by silence," and read them aloud in the flat. Unhurried voice of a man reading a debt column, while the hall listened in a silence broken only by a bird somewhere in the rafters going on, indifferent, with its ordinary business. Edmund did not shout, and did not run, and did not, even then, entirely lose the smoothness that had carried him this far. He only sat very still, his gloved hand pressed flat against the table's edge the way, Lynette realised, with a small unwilling ache, a man presses his hand against a blow he cannot let his face report. When at last he spoke, it was not denial. He said, low, that his own father had died a poor relation in a rich man's house, passed over for the stewardship twice, in favour of lesser men with better names, and that he had promised himself as a boy he would never again be the Vantry left standing outside a locked door while someone else was handed the keys. It was not an excuse, and no one in that hall mistook it for one. But it was, Linnet thought, watching the old grief move plainly across his ruined composure. For the first time she had ever seen his face without its varnish. Entirely true, and true grief, however badly it had been spent, could not be answered with more cruelty than it had already caused. Sir Josiah, after a long silence, pronounced the estate's sentence, not the law's, dismissal from every office and every expectation the will had ever named him to, a modest allowance sufficient to keep him from want, and insufficient to keep him from remembering exactly what he had thrown away, and exile from the county entire, reasoned aloud not as mercy to the guilty, but as protection of the innocent. The tenants who need not watch a disgraced man paraded through their own harvest court twice, and Araminta, who deserved to build whatever came next without his shadow standing in the doorway of it. The hall exhaled altogether, the way a held breath finally lets go, and someone at the back, Sixsmith, unmistakably said, to no one in particular, that weeds died in daylight, root and all. Same as he'd always said, and a ripple of something that was almost laughter moved through the benches, the first the hall had permitted itself all morning. It was full dark before Julian found her again in the glass-house, where she had gone, once the hall emptied, simply to stand among the green things a while, and let her hands stop shaking. He came without ceremony, his coat still smelling faintly of the tenants' hall's tallow candles, and stood a long moment looking at the beds she had built out of a ruin before he spoke. He said that the trustees had confirmed the will satisfied, that very afternoon, the fortune secured, the debts answerable, nothing further required of either of them by law or by lawyer, and that she was, from this hour, free to leave Larkspur with every provision he could arrange, and no claim of his ever laid against her again, if that was what she wished. He said it plainly, without flourish, watching her face the way a man watches ground he has finally learned not to assume he understands. She told him that she had not stayed married to a stranger's bargain this long to leave, now that the bargain no longer required her. He said that was not quite an answer to what he had asked. She said, then, that she was staying because she wished it, and for no other reason left standing, and watched something in his face come undone in a way she had not seen it come undone even at the reading of his own father's ruin. He told her, that night, the whole of what he had owed her since the potting-shed floor first gave up its secret, that he had spent 5 years deciding alone who might be spent to protect this house, his father's memory included, and had very nearly spent her the same careless way before he learned better. He said he did not mean to decide alone again what might be risked, in this marriage or any other matter of it, and she told him that was, of every vow either of them had made before a vicar or a trustee, the first one she entirely believed. He said he had given her a ruin to occupy her hands, meaning it as the smallest kindness he had left to offer a stranger. She told him he had given her, without knowing it, the one true thing he owned that was not mortgaged to somebody else's fear, and that she had given it back to him mended. He laughed then, low and real, the second time she had heard it and the first time she had heard it without surprise attached, and outside the glass-house glass a robin that had nested in the ruin's ironwork since before either of them arrived went on singing into the frost, indifferent and constant, the way it had sung through every version of this room's ruin and repair alike. The wedding they had already had needed no repeating in any church, but Sixsmith insisted, and Mrs. Pell the housekeeper wept openly through the small blessing the parish vicar spoke over their joined hands beside the glass-house door in the last week of Advent. Candles set along every window-sill of the reglazed panes, so the whole building glowed gold against the snow. the first light the orangery had held in a decade that was not borrowed from the sun. Sixsmith stood witness, with his rake, absurdly, still over one shoulder, and cried without shame when the vicar finished, and was teased for it gently by Tam for a full year after. Araminta Blythe, released from an engagement no one in the county now wished her to keep, spent the following spring quietly, and returned the next autumn engaged instead to a mild, kind widower 2 parishes over, who had never once needed her family's fortune to love her, and wrote to Lynette twice a year after, always signing herself, with a private joke only the 2 of them now understood. A woman who has learned to ask the right question of a door before she believes what is said through it. Pruitt kept his nursery and his silence money conscience both, chastened, and supplied every citrus tree the reglazed orangery required at cost for the rest of his working life. Penance he never once called penance aloud. Edmund Vantry lived out his exile in a small house 2 counties distant on his modest allowance, and wrote, once the following winter, a single unanswered letter to Sir Josiah, asking only whether the orangery had held through the frost, which Sir Josiah read aloud to no one, and kept, folded, in his own private drawer, as evidence, he said, that even a ruined man's grief could still, occasionally, ask an honest question. By the time true winter closed its hand over the county that year, the harvest in the open fields had come in thin and blighted, storm battered in August, and frost-struck in September, and half the tenant families who had wagered against the Duchess's glasshouse in October found themselves, in December, walking up the frozen drive to receive from her own hands baskets of forced greens and stored roots, and, by the hardest weeks of January, the first small sweet oranges Larkspur had grown in a generation, grafted from Pruitt's honest stock onto her father's old hardy rootings, the fruit no larger than a child's fist and tasting, Sixsmith swore, of nothing so much as vindication. What had begun as a ruin given to occupy a woman's idle hands became, before the snow was done falling, the one larder in the county that did not empty, and the wager book at the village shop, Lynette heard, was quietly burned rather than settled. No one willing to collect on a bet the whole parish had by then decided it was glad to have lost. Almost a year to the day after that first cold morning in the study, Julian found her again exactly where he had first sent her, kneeling in the glass-house with dark earth on her hands and her father's knife at her belt, and this time he did not set down a pen and speak without looking up. He knelt beside her in the dirt in his good coat, careless of it entirely, and set into her open palm a small brass dibber, new forged but old-fashioned in its make, her father's initials worked into the handle exactly as they had worn into the original, and said only that a woman ought not to occupy her hands with borrowed tools forever. She closed her fingers around it, and around his hand still holding it, and told him that he had given her a ruin once to keep her busy, and that between the 2 of them, root and ledger both read honestly in the light, they had gone and made it a whole county's larder instead, which she thought, on the whole, a fair return on so small and grudging a gift. Outside the glass the same robin, or its near kin, went on with its ordinary singing. Indifferent to duchesses and disgraced cousins and buried daybooks alike, keeping the only ledger it had ever needed, which was simply that the light kept coming back, season on season, to a room that had once been given up for lost. And if this quiet, stubborn kind of story warmed you tonight, the kind where the truth was never really lost, only waiting under the floor for someone patient enough to ask it the right question, then pull your chair a little nearer the fire before you go. There is always a place kept here for you, a kettle that does not mind staying warm a while longer, and I would love nothing more than to hear, in the comments, which line stayed with you longest. The knock of that first careless gift, or the day the ledger finally spoke. Stay if you will, and light a lamp for the next one. It costs nothing to keep a seat by this hearth, only the wish to come back to it. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle, as Linnet was, with the quiet ones the world has stopped bothering to ask any questions of at all.